Hi everyone. I'd like to talk to you about the election and the importance of voting, but I'd particularly like to talk to you about misconceptions that some people may have about the election and how it impacts people with disabilities. Some may say that disability rights and the needs of children and adults with disabilities are not a red or blue issue. Wrong. I'll give you a few reasons in a minute why they are absolutely important, and the election makes a difference in terms of who you vote for. I also want to speak to the people who may say they're still undecided, or they're thinking that they may not vote because it doesn't really matter how the election comes out. Specifically, I'd like to give you six reasons why this election is the most consequential election for children and adults with disabilities in decades. First is that we need the federal government to fully fund the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's been promised since it was adopted in 1975, and it has never been delivered. The Republicans have had the last 4 years in order to provide that funding and have failed to do so. They control the presidency currently, they control the Senate, and yet no action to provide full funding for special education. Second thing that's happened under the watch of the Republican Party, again, both through the presidency and the Senate, and particularly through the efforts of Department of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, is that more and more money has been diverted from public education to be provided to charter schools and for vouchers to support the ability to pay for private schools. Private schools are good for some people. They're not good for most kids with special education needs, and they often discriminate against people with disabilities, both in terms of the students they accept and the adults that they're willing to hire. It's also incredibly debilitating for the public schools if the money that had previously been provided for the public schools is shifted and given to vouchers or charter schools instead. In order to have adequate funding for public schools, in order to have good services through the public schools, which are available to all children, we need to stop the efforts of the Trump administration and the Republican Party to privatize the U.S. educational system. We need to stop that in its tracks, and that requires voting on the Democratic side in this election. Concurrent with that, the Trump administration has also weakened civil rights protections and weakened civil rights enforcement. And that's particularly come up in relation to issues that are related to children with disabilities, where pronouncements from Secretary DeVos and the senior leaders of the U.S. Department of Education have resulted in a reorientation that makes it harder for individual families to bring cases, at the same time that it makes it less likely that there will be systemic investigations and enforcement actions to protect the rights of people with disabilities. So we need the existing laws to be strengthened, not weakened, and that's another reason why it does matter who you vote for in these elections. It matters in relation to the Congress, and it matters in relation to who you vote for president. Another thing that's happening that's frightening is that the Trump administration is saying that they're going to scale back on benefits for Social Security, for Medicare, for Medicaid, and they're going to try to overturn Obamacare. That's important for everybody because everybody benefits from some or all of those programs. And certainly we all benefit from Medicare when we get older. So that's a concern. But it's especially a concern because the president has repeatedly promised that there would be minimal impact on people with disabilities and minimal impact on pre-existing conditions. And yet there has been zero proposal made by the White House to actually describe what they're going to replace all of these programs with that will protect the people who are most vulnerable and in need and ensure that they get the coverage that they require in order to be able to be treated when they're ill and to be able to live in relation to their chronic health conditions. We've got to support continued and robust Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and health care coverage for everyone in order for us to protect the especially vulnerable people with disabilities, children with disabilities, and the elderly. You can also see the direction that enforcement of the law is going through the appointments to the Supreme Court. Neil Gorsuch, who's one of the Supreme Court justices who was nominated by President Trump and approved, is actually the author of a terrible circuit court opinion that basically said that the obligation of the schools in providing a free, appropriate public education was only to ensure that the school services provided services that were minimally necessary, not the robust standard that the Supreme Court adopted in the Andrew F. case. And it's likely, with continuing appointments of both district court judges and additional Supreme Court judges, that the courts are going to grow increasingly more conservative in their interpretation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. We need to have courts protecting people with disabilities, not eroding their rights. And in order to accomplish that, we need to be sure that the drumbeat of appointments of conservative judges intent on eviscerating these laws is stopped. Finally, and most critical at the moment, the pandemic affects everyone. Everybody in the country is affected by it, but it especially affects children and adults with disabilities who are often far more vulnerable to the impact of that illness than other people are, as they are vulnerable to the potential impact when their caregivers or teachers or healthcare workers also get sick. The pandemic is devastating our society. It's particularly devastating for children and adults with disabilities, and we need to take aggressive action to control the pandemic, to be able to have vaccines for the pandemic, to be able to treat the pandemic, and to keep people safe while the process of developing those tools is going on. Just yesterday, Mark Meadows, President Trump's chief of staff, actually admitted that the pandemic couldn't be controlled, though all of the health experts who've been talking about this at a national level have indicated that it would be relatively easy to control the pandemic if we utilize appropriate measures. So the federal government, the White House, President Trump, are essentially giving up on the control of the pandemic, giving up on the protection of all of us, and especially giving up on the most vulnerable. We need to stop that in its tracks. We need leadership to ensure that the pandemic is brought under control in a responsible way as quickly as possible. And while that's happening, we need to have greater financial support for all of our institutions, the schools, state government, small businesses, and individual families, so that we can all survive the pandemic with a degree of financial health. We need action now, not just letting the pandemic play out as if it was going to die out on its own. These are all reasons that I hope you will think about in who you vote for, and that applies at the congressional level, it applies at the state and local level, it applies especially at the Senate, and most of all, it applies in relation to who we elect as president. I don't normally engage in endorsements through my law practice, but many people have the misunderstanding that the political decisions and who you vote for don't matter in relation to disability rights. That's not true. It's always mattered, but it matters even more in this election than it ever has before. Please be safe, and please vote for a stronger and healthier country. Thank you very much.